the kind of September when life was slow and oh so mellow. Try to remember the kind of September when grass was green and grain was yellow.
September 4th, 1962. In the tiny Sullivan Street Theater, way off Broadway in New York, a little-known musical with a cardboard moon and hand-tossed confetti was in the middle of the third year of what would become the longest-running musical of all time. This off-Broadway classic, The Fantastics, would make the careers of Jerry Orbach, Liza Minnelli, Glenn Close, F. Murray Abraham, Kristen Chenoweth, and Ricardo Montalban.
Try to remember when life was so.
In Washington, D.C., CIA Director John A. McCone was briefing President John F. Kennedy regarding a looming crisis. U-2 spy planes revealed that Russian anti-aircraft missiles had been sent to Cuba, which, said McCone, only made sense if Moscow intended to use them to shield a base for ballistic missiles aimed at the U.S. McCone's insight proved correct. And in a bucolic suburban township of Philadelphia, 600-plus students moved up from their familiar junior high haunts to Haverford Township Senior High. These students would come of age in historic times. This is their story in 7 parts.
The heart is hollow. Deep in December, it's nice to remember the fire of September.
5 years earlier, during the Eisenhower administration, the Russians had launched the first successful artificial satellite, Sputnik 1.
The United States, with a fledgling satellite program of its own, was caught flat-footed. It would not be until 3 months later, January 31st, 1958, that the United States launched its own satellite, Explorer 1. The space race was in high gear. In 1961, then newly elected President John Fitzgerald Kennedy made an electrifying promise to the nation during a speech at Rice University.
May never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept.
In response to President Kennedy's challenge and a perceived gap in science and mathematics education, school districts like Haverford Township increased their core curriculum, adding classes in chemistry, physics, biology, geometry, algebra, and calculus. And the class of 1965 responded to these academic challenges. Scott Paper's popular radio quiz show, IQ, challenged the academic prowess of the Forteans in 10 categories, ranging from math to Shakespeare. Forteans responded to these challenges high scores and victories all 3 years. No high school honor is more prestigious than the National Honor Society. Since 1925, Haverford Township has had a National Honor Society chapter. The class of 1965 added to the ranks of its distinguished scholars, with 22 members recognized in their junior year and 72 in their senior year.
Try to remember, and if you remember.
As they entered high school in the fall of 1962, only 4 careers were available to most young women: teaching, secretarial work, nursing, and the lifelong career of homemaker.
In that same year of 1962, an article by the young journalist Gloria Steinem appeared in Esquire about the way in which women are forced to choose between a career and marriage. The article provoked great national debate. Then, as 1963 began, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, which described what Friedan called the problem that has no name: the widespread unhappiness of women in the 1950s and early 1960s who were unhappy despite living in material comfort and being married with children. Steinem and Friedan gave intellectual underpinning to what would be called the second feminist movement. Combined with increasing birth control choices, women were finding greater flexibility in family planning and career choices. In 1964, Delaware County established the Council for Higher Education. Coupled with the already stated national objective for a highly educated workforce in science and technology, local surveys, county residents, and businesses confirmed the need and the support for a community college. As the class of 1965 graduated, most were college or higher education bound. 50 years after graduation, the class of 65, women and men both, have made successful careers in science and technology, news and the media, medicine and biotech, academia and teaching, business and industry, the arts, law and religion. And yes, classmates, both women and men, have taken the time to raise families, grandchildren, and animal companions. The class of 1965 is rightly proud of all its accomplishments.
Try to remember, and if you remember, then follow.
To steal a line from Charles Dickens, the years of Haverford were, in terms of national and foreign affairs, the best of times and the worst of times.
Just 2 weeks after we arrived in September 1962, the U.S. Justice Department filed its first lawsuit to end public school desegregation. It was a landmark case, but that was clearly no deterrent to Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett. On September 20th, he refused to admit James Meredith to the University of Mississippi. As we learned how to navigate the corridors of Haverford, the battle over civil rights escalated in the streets, the schools, and the courthouses. But on October 22nd, that battle was overshadowed by President John F. Kennedy's nationally televised address, alerting us that Russia was about to install missiles in Cuba, the first national crisis Kennedy confronted. President Kennedy established a blockade of our island neighbor, took a tough stance with the Russians, and ultimately prevailed. That summer, memorable, indeed historic events occurred. President Kennedy, visiting West Berlin in June, declared Ich bin ein Berliner, meaning that he too was a Berliner. In August that year, the Reverend Martin Luther King led a march on Washington, culminating in his famous I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial. By November of junior year, Vietnam, which for most of us had been an obscure dot on the world map, was making news. Leaders of a military coup in South Vietnam assassinated the president, Ngo Dinh Diem, on November 2nd. It was a catalyst that sparked the surge in U.S. troops in country. And then, on November 22nd, another critical day that none of our class will ever forget, a lone gunman firing from a window in the Texas School Book Depository assassinated President Kennedy. That elevated Lyndon Johnson to the presidency. By March, LBJ had declared war on poverty and promised civil rights advances. As we toiled in our summer jobs in 1964, Barry Goldwater became the Republican Party nominee for president, and North Vietnam torpedoed our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, providing a rationale to escalate the war effort in Vietnam. As we began senior year, Martin Luther King won the Nobel Prize. It was the same day Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev was removed from office and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. On November 3rd, LBJ was elected in a landslide victory over Goldwater. Of course, we had already elected Terry Lee as student council president. As we turned toward graduation in 1965, Winston Churchill, the last of the great World War II Ally leaders, died. His funeral on January 30th, 1965, was the largest state funeral ever held. Despite Johnson's formidable work in civil rights, housing, and poverty, the Vietnam War gradually and inexorably became an albatross for his administration, and indeed, our nation. On March 30th, a bomb exploded in front of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, killing 22 people and wounding another 183. 5 weeks later, the first large-scale deployment of Army ground troops arrived in South Vietnam. In June, as we marched on the football field to the podium to receive our Haverford diplomas, U.S. troops in Vietnam were ordered to go on the attack. 2 months later, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which prohibited voting discrimination against minorities, an issue that sadly continues to be debated in Congress and the courts. For all of us, it was an eventful 3 years, years of tragedy, turmoil, and triumph at home and abroad, years that even 5 decades later have had a profound effect on our nation's history and on our own personal histories.
It wasn't all seriousness those 3 years. The class of '65 still found time for social clubs, social service, time out to relax at Friday night dances, and the proms.
While today's high school students are encouraged and often expected to add service projects to their high school experience, the class of '65 naturally volunteered to do these things. Whether it was through Worldwide Workshop, the Girls Service Club, or High Y, Fordians in great number gave service to the school, the Haverford Township area, and overseas. Social clubs representing the various language arts in French, German, Latin, and Spanish offered multicultural experiences in language, history, art, and cuisine. Specialty clubs like chess and art developed our brains and our creativity. But when school let out, a whole different set of social activities held sway. Friday night dances and Christmas socials lit up weekends and holiday seasons. On May 24th, 1964, we were enchanted by Eddie Stewart's band at the Magic Mill, where Joanne Buchanan was crowned prom queen with her court, Sarah Bent, Rita Calvi, Jan Schaefer, and Marlene Zollner. And on April 3rd, 1965, we were whisked away like Dorothy and Toto down an old yellow brick road to the music of Mike Pedersen's band into the Emerald City in our last official and traditional dance. Bob Dylan reminded us the times they were a-changin', and our taste in music was changing too, forsaking the innocent music of the 1950s for a harder-edged rock and roll. And in a recent survey of our classmates, Satisfaction was voted the top song of our class. And as we now know, we would see even greater changes in the social fabric in the years to come.
Satisfaction, 'cause I tried, and I tried, and I tried, and I tried.
Try to remember, and if you remember, then follow.
Although considered extracurricular activities back in the early 1960s, sports were still an important part of the class of 1965.
In addition to developing strong minds, the administration at Haverford High sought to develop healthy bodies as well. Physical education was mandatory for all students, and sports were encouraged, even on the intramural level or non-traditional sports like bowling or ping pong. The varsity and JV teams of each sport gave many opportunities to excel. As school began each fall, students could play football, cross-country, field hockey, and soccer. Cheerleaders added spirit to football and basketball games. Successful seasons in cross-country, field hockey, and soccer, and a spirited football season, with 3 of our classmates taking all suburban honors, capped the fall of our senior year. As the weather changed, so did the sports. Now it was indoor sports at which the Fords could excel. And excel they did. The women's basketball team had a perfect record of 9-0-0. The men's basketball team, returning with only 3 lettermen, fought valiantly nonetheless. A successful women's swim team and individual men's swimming records capped the season in the pool. The wrestlers had their best season in years with an 8-3 record, in addition to taking trophies at multi-team tournaments. And the volleyball team netted its 2nd consecutive PIAA District 1 championship and placed 5th in the state. The crack of the bat and the whoosh of the golf ball signaled the opening of the spring sports season. Strong teams were fielded in golf, track, baseball, men and women's lacrosse, and men and women's tennis. Many of our classmates lettered in 2 or even 3 sports each year, and for many, the groundwork laid in their high school years has led to careers in athletics, athletic management, and physical education. We all owe Haverford a debt of gratitude for the foresight to help us develop healthy bodies as well as healthy minds.
Try to remember, and if you remember, then follow.
The arts and media were an integral and colorful part of the experience of every Haverford student, whether they experienced it as a creator, producer, or consumer.
Every month, and sometimes more frequently, students, faculty, and staff could pick up their own copy of the Fortean, the Haverford High School newspaper. Produced by a staff of 30 to 40 students, the Fortean amassed many awards during our 3 years at HHS, including awards by the Pennsylvania School Press Association and the Columbia Press Association. WHHS, our radio station, was the first educational FM station in the United States run by high school students. At 89.3 on the FM dial, the 5-watt station on a 7-mile radius, broadcasting between the hours of 2:30 and 5 p.m., the station offered a mix of music, sports, and educational programming. It offered live broadcasts of home and away football and basketball games. The literary magazine, Pen and Ink, the photography club, and the art club gave outlets to those with an artistic bent. Putting out 2 to 3 magazines a year, the 40-member staff of Pen and Ink, like the staff of the Fortean, won acclamations by the Pennsylvania School Press Association
and the Columbia Press Association. The arts, of course, are not just visual, but also meant to be heard. In addition to marching and playing at football games and pep rallies, the band was a goodwill ambassador, opening Haverford, a state hospital, performing exchanges with Bethesda, Maryland, and raising money for a John Philip Sousa Memorial in Washington, D.C. Composed of over 100 students, the orchestra played a variety of music from classical to pop in several venues, both locally as well as in state competitions. 6 members of the class made all-state orchestra. The choruses of HHS, including the a cappella choir, sang both at school functions and to large venues, such as an audience of 800 at the Union League and an equal number at the Shriners Club. Students with talents for jazz, Broadway, pop, folk, and rock music were not left out of the picture. Talent shows and hootenannies gave a place for budding artists to show their stuff. Lastly, we cannot forget the work of the Greystones staff, whose work chronicled our 3 years at HHS. We thank them for preserving these memories we share tonight.
Try to remember, and if you remember, then follow.
Born in the 1940s, just as World War II ended, the Haverford High class of 1965 has seen 7 decades go by.
In the 50s, as fledgling students, we filed into Brookline, Chestnut Walls, Coopertown, Lanark, Linwood, Manila, Oakmont, and Preston. These were our grade schools where we learned to duck and cover as well as read and write. As the 50s progressed into the 60s, we entered junior high together, along with those who transferred from parochial, private, or other public schools. 3 years later, we moved up to Haverford High and then graduated in June 1965. After graduation, the draft in the Vietnam War called many of our classmates, and they served our country with distinction, some giving the full measure of devotion. Most of us went on to college or careers, and many of us had advanced degrees in medicine, law, science, teaching, art, and theology. Life called us all to careers, to partners and spouses, to extended, blended, and animal companion families. 50 years after graduation, our ranks are 10% thinner now, and we now call many places home. A number of us still call Havertown home, and 110 of us live in the tri-state area of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. 6 live in New York, 7 in Maryland, 1 in D.C., making 123 who live in the Mid-Atlantic. 12 live in New England, 44 live in the South, not surprisingly the largest number in Florida. 8 live in the Midwest, 22 live in the West, 1 lives in Alaska, another lives in Ontario. And the rest of you, 336 classmates, we don't know where you live. Log into www.haverfordhigh65.com. There are classmates you have not seen in 50 years who would love to hear from you. Your video team wishes you a happy 50th anniversary of your graduation from Haverford High.